These days, there are only really a few major game publishers: EA, Activision, Ubisoft, Warner Brothers, Take-Two, and so on. But back during the Wild West days of the industry during the 80s and 90s, there were tons of game publishers that gradually died off one by one as the industry became more exclusionarily expensive in the 90s into the 2000s. Midway, Acclaim, Ocean, the 3DO Company, GT Interactive, Williams, Gremlin Interactive, Accolade, The Game Factory, US Gold, Virgin Interactive, f***ing Titus, and that's just a small list of the more recognizable game publishers that were either bought out or went out of business. But there's one particular game publisher / developer that's always stuck out to me as one of the more prolific publishers of the era. One that, despite at their peak being one of the biggest publishers in the industry, doesn't really get talked about all that much these days. And it's a publishing company that's extremely recognizable to those of us who know about it, and even to some people who don't because of their incredibly distinctive logo, that being the owl orb. Yes, that's right, it's Psygnosis. And yes, it's pronounced Psygnosis. How do I know? Because of this 1996 promotional video.
Psygnosis is at the forefront of development and design.
It's one of the most intriguing game developers / publishers that I've come across, and the work that they attached themselves to seemingly keeps showing up in my line of work. And I'm happy to have that be the case because I find them uniquely interesting. Originally an independent company, they were eventually bought out by Sony, and despite being prolific in the 90s, they would gradually fade away in a bit of a tragically slow death. So I wanted to take a little examination into their history, as well as really take a look at the distinctiveness that was their output. The reason that Psygnosis has always been somewhat appealing to me is that I like weird games. Part of the reason why I love the PS1 era so much is because of how distinctive that era was in so many different ways. Because it's back when 3D games were brand new and nobody really had discovered the right and wrong way to do things. There was no iteration or refinement of ideas yet. Everything that was made was purely down to experimentation, and as a result, you got a lot of weird but very distinctive games. And one of my favorite things about games is the ability to sit down and really immerse yourself in someone's wacky world. Something you don't really get these days with larger games because everything's been so refined and committee designed to the point of almost having universally standardized mechanics and controls, which means that generally you don't get completely horrible games at the same rate you used to, but it means that things are less interesting in the AAA space, and the fact is, for me, Psygnosis kind of represented the apex of that weird creative design era of games that I liked so much. Because they simultaneously published and developed a lot of games, and whenever you saw that logo, you could be sure that whatever it was going to be at least an interesting game, if not a good game. Take, for example, Chronicles of the Sword. It was a painfully slow point-and-click adventure game based in Arthurian myths. It was an interesting game to think about, if only for the absolute train wreck that it was, but it's not a good game whatsoever. Then there's something like Sentinel Returns, one of the most batshit insane puzzle games I've ever played. Built around a stacking mechanic, an overseeing entity, and an aesthetic reminiscent of a bad drug trip. A really fun game once you understand it, but it's also one of the most unorthodox games you'll ever play. This is kind of the spectrum with the company. Good or bad, you can expect something at least worth talking about. The history of Psygnosis goes all the way back to the early 80s, and as with most companies that would eventually rise to their size, it started out pretty humbly. Psygnosis began in Liverpool, England, and was actually an offshoot of the company Imagine Software, which was also a British game developer / publisher. The games that Imagine Software published were largely solo-developed games like Arcadia or Frantic. This was very much a bedroom programmery age. And of course, they also made their own games in-house, such as Wacky Waiters, Jumping Jack, or Stonkers. Somehow I'm not making any of that up. Despite this, the company ran for just under 2 years before amassing hundreds of thousands of British pounds worth of debt, and ultimately the company went bankrupt, with all their assets being sold off to various companies including Ocean Software, after which Ian Hetherington and David Lawson, two of the founding fathers of Imagine Software, broke off to create Fire Iron in 1985. You see, as is usually the case with copyright law, after Imagine Software went bankrupt, their projects that were still in development were liquidated and sold off to other companies. In this case, most notably something called the Mega Games, which were much hyped games that were rumored to be specifically designed to push computing systems at the time beyond their limits. Ambitious, but none of them ended up seeing the light of day, as even once a company called Sinclair Research bought out the rights to said Mega Games and contracted the aforementioned Fire Iron to complete the one game that was the furthest along, called Bandersnatch, funding was pulled shortly thereafter, and that was the end of that. I guess that's why they were called Imagine Software, because that's all you could do. So where does Psygnosis come into this? Well, Psygnosis was actually a completely separate entity that was created in the previous year, 1984. Psygnosis primarily started off as an offshoot to attempt to reacquire Imagine's assets under a different company name, but they soon began to develop their own games. Starting off with a rather humble game called Britakis, which was said to contain many of the ideas that had gone into the now dead game Bandersnatch. And from there, they were off to the races, making multiple games per year. Games such as Pteropods, Obliterator, and Infestation. I obviously wasn't alive around this time, but based on what I can tell, the Barbarian games seem to be their most notable games around this time. Particularly praised for their stunning visuals, and Psygnosis would also start to publish games at a frankly frightening rate, publishing 4 games in 1989, 5 games in 1990, 7 in 1991, and so on. From what I understand, they also wouldn't just sit idly by and handle distribution for the games they published. Apparently early on, for some of the games they published, Psygnosis would actually send some of their in-house artists to help assist development, which would help the games under their label stand out as having a distinct flavor and led to the notoriety they had in the industry. Keep in mind though, since this was a UK-based company, not every one of their games really got all that much exposure outside of the UK, which is why bringing some of these games up as big deals may confuse you, especially because a large chunk of them were primarily PC games, and in the 80s, PC gaming was far more popular in Europe than it was stateside. It wouldn't be until 1989 when any game tangentially related to them would see a console release, and that was the game Ballistics. And even then, the console in question was the TurboGrafx-16. And fun fact, Psygnosis actually went under a different company name in that case, calling themselves Cyclops. Apparently in the early days of their publishing, they would sometimes go under this label. Although while the game did release on TurboGrafx-16, it wasn't published by them on TurboGrafx-16. Publishing duties was handed over to another company, in this case called NEC Technologies. Meanwhile, the first game that they were involved with that came out on consoles that anybody actually owned was Shadow of the Beast, which initially released in 1989 on Amiga, but came out between 1990 and 1992 on everything else, including Sega Genesis. A game which was looked upon fondly at the time for its advanced graphic technologies and cutting-edge atmosphere, but these days is slightly more maligned for its overbearing difficulty and simple gameplay. Of course, that was merely published by Psygnosis, and also Electronic Arts was somehow involved. Though we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit, despite their first game that they developed coming out in 1986, from what I can tell, the first game that wasn't made by Psygnosis but was actually published by them came out only 2 years later in 1988. And it was the bizarrely named Captain Fizz Meets the Blastertrons. It was a simpler time. And despite creating a lot of games in-house even through their golden period, it quickly became apparent that publishing was going to be their bread and butter. And believe it or not, a lot of notable studios actually got their start and or worked with Psygnosis very early into their existence. If you were publishing your games onto any sort of PC in Europe, chances are you're going through Psygnosis. Some of the notable studios they collaborated with includes Reflections Interactive, which would go on to big things. Now operating under the Ubisoft banner as Ubisoft Reflections, previously being the lead developers on the Driver series, but also famously handling the Just Dance games until 2017. They also collaborated with Blue Byte, which would go on to become Ubisoft Blue Byte, who are responsible for several different franchises. They're even apparently responsible for Beyond Good and Evil 2, but as if that game's ever actually going to come out. They also collaborated with Raising Hell Software, which would go on to become Bizarre Creations, probably most famous for the likes of Blur and the Project Gotham Racing series. They also published the very first game by Traveler's Tales, a very prolific game developer most famous for their work on the various LEGO games. But the most notable publishing alum of Psygnosis around this time would be a little company called DMA Design. Matter of fact, Psygnosis published the first 12 games that this little upstart company in Edinburgh, Scotland made, including Menace, Blood Money, and of course the Lemmings series. One of the biggest video game franchises to come out of Europe in the early 90s and would go on to spawn like a dozen sequels. Some of you may wonder why I'm making such a big deal out of this company, but many of you may be aware that DMA Design would eventually go on to change its name to Rockstar North. Yeah, potentially the most influential game developer in history. And the company with the Owl Orb was the company that helped get them off the ground. Matter of fact, I would say publishing Lemmings was such a big deal for its day that it's the very thing that gave Psygnosis its value when time came for a potential sale. They had gained quite a reputation for themselves by this point through their publishing branch as well as their in-house development branch. Granted, it wasn't always a good reputation. Going back to the mega games of Imagine Software, they always wanted to be known for making extremely beautiful games that push the hardware boundaries, and they certainly were known for that. Several of their games were considered to be some of the most graphically advanced games of their time, particularly on the Amiga. However, their catalog was often maligned for less than stellar gameplay, a reputation that they would have difficulty shaking off until the mid-90s. By the first decade of their existence, they had proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had learned from the sins of their previous incarnation, and had been able to make a splash in the European games market like very few before them, offering prolific products and maintaining a steady income stream with their various high-profile intellectual properties. And yet, this was still far from their golden age. That would come in the mid-90s, because in 1993, Sony Electronic Publishing, which would go on to be renamed Sony Computer Entertainment, purchased Psygnosis for the sum of 20 million British pounds. The equivalent of roughly 52 million today. Multiply that by 1.48, which was the British pound conversion rate for 1993, and you have the equivalent of roughly $77 million USD.
And then you add Kurt Angle to the mix!
So why did Sony want to acquire them? Well, the first and most obvious reason is that they wanted to bolster their games lineup in preparation for the launch of the PlayStation, which was set to come out in Japan not too long after, and in the rest of the world about a year later. So they wanted to have a developer-publisher with a proven track record on board. Having a company like this, which already had an extremely prolific lineup and had existed for almost a decade, was a no-brainer. Of course, their acquisition also resulted in some unspoken benefits. First of all would be instant penetration into the European games market, which is known to be a bit more complicated to navigate for non-European countries. So they had a company on board that could navigate the waters for them. The benefit of having a strong market presence in Europe right off the bat is that Nintendo, being the frontrunner in the console market in North America, had largely botched their European presence and was only starting to gain a foothold by the early 90s. So between Nintendo's long struggling presence and Sega about to screw the pooch with the Sega Saturn, the European games market was ripe for somebody coming in and taking over. There were, of course, some other smaller competitors, such as the Amiga brand of family entertainment, such as the Amiga CD32. Then you had things like the 3DO, but to call those consoles competition would be insanely generous. Basically, this allowed Sony with the PlayStation to walk into the European console market and take the whole thing over without much of a fight. And a lot of that had to do with Psygnosis doing a lot of the legwork. The second unspoken benefit would be development units. Psygnosis partnered with another English company called SN Systems, known for creating various development kits for various platforms, to create a brand new, easy-to-use developer kit for PlayStation systems, which was a great help in using a couple of established companies in getting the market into making games for this unproven console. From the moment they were purchased all the way through until the end of the PlayStation 1 era, to me, is the golden era of Psygnosis. During this time, they were able to open up different satellite offices all over the UK and the world. They had already opened a few offices before the purchase, like the Boston office in 1991, then the studio in Stroud, Chester, and Paris. But after the purchase, they expanded their operations to London, Frankfurt, Sydney, Germany, I don't know specifically where, and even Foster City, California. Suddenly, with the backing of Sony, they went on to become a worldwide brand. This is also my personal favorite era of theirs because it's where the aspects that I like about them came out so much. Novastorm, for example, developed and published by Psygnosis, one of the worst games I've ever played, but it was very distinct. The Adventures of Lomax, an extremely beautiful but also very strange 2D platformer. Crazy Ivan, crazy with a K, so presumably it's tying into Mortal Kombat. This strange mech-based first-person shooter with cheesy FMV cutscenes. Had its issues, but it had a cheesiness that made it fun. Sentient, this strange first-person adventure game with various potential paths that led to tons of replayability. Of course, when you think of this era of games made by Psygnosis, you will no doubt go back to one of three separate franchises. First of all, G-Police, a series that I've never played but I understand has a cult following. Then you have Colony Wars, the first of which is actually a game that I picked up a while ago just off the back of it looking kind of interesting, and I only played it for the first time recently, and I gotta say, Colony Wars is a pretty bangin' franchise. With slick, intuitive space combat that punches way above its weight in terms of presentation, and the gameplay is solid. Then, strangely enough, and even though this is right in front of my face, I still have a hard time believing it, Psygnosis also ported the first Darkstalkers game to PS1. Wrap your mind around that. Then you have the big one, Wipeout. And no, we're not talking about obstacle course game shows here, we're talking about the futuristic racing game. One of the earliest heavy-hitter franchises on the PlayStation. It wasn't one of those big in-your-face PlayStation exclusives. It was one content chilling in the back doing its own thing, and the people who played those games knew exactly how awesome they were. But with that said, since their bread and butter was absolutely still their publishing branch, there is no bigger franchise published by them than the Destruction Derby series. As unassuming as it is these days, Destruction Derby was one of the biggest games of 1995. Considered at the time to be one of the most advanced, best-produced racing games of all time, with a level of detail that seems quaint in hindsight but was groundbreaking at the time. Pieces actually broke off your cars. That was a big deal. Aside from that, they were also responsible for publishing things like Discworld, a beloved series for point-and-click adventure game fans, and was considered to be a very big deal in Europe. They published the movie tie-in game for A Bug's Life, which reviewed poorly, but I think is underrated. Of course, for me, this is where my interest for the company comes from, because once you get past their major games they published, there's a slew of weird and wonderful games they stamped their name on. ODT, Shipwreckers, Roscoe McQueen Firefighter Extreme, Rascal, and of course the two games I brought up at the beginning of this video, which I will admit partially inspired this little retrospective, Sentinel Returns and Chronicles of the Sword. I have spoken in the past about how every now and again I'll go to my local retro game shop and pick up some PS1 games I've never heard of that catch my eye. Every single one of these games are exactly that, games that I've bought purely off of them catching my eye. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, and as a matter of fact, Rascal is known as potentially the worst game on the entire console. But every single one of them are interesting to talk about, and either it's a point of random chaos theory that means picking random games that look interesting results in one particular publisher dominating, or there's something uniquely appealing that draws me to these games. And the rest of the industry would agree, given that in the 1995-1996 fiscal year, Psygnosis accounted for no less than 40% of all game sales in Europe. That's right, 2 out of every 5 games sold in Europe between April 1st, 1995 and March 31st, 1996 in some way or another went through this company. Not only that, but in 1995, apparently 25% of all PlayStation games sold were in some way connected to Psygnosis. Granted, 1995 wasn't a great year for games. They were on fire, which once again honestly makes it kind of weird that you don't hear this company brought up when discussing the great defunct game publishers of the past. You still hear discussions about Midway or Acclaim or Accolade, just to name a few. If I had to guess, it's probably because many of the franchises of this era that held the company up are no longer really being made. Meanwhile, Accolade is still discussed because Bubsy is somehow still alive. Then Mortal Kombat is still a big deal, so obviously Midway is still something talked about quite a bit, but I digress. Going into the turn of the millennium is when the good times more or less ended for the company. Up until 1999, they had been a relatively independent entity of Sony and the PlayStation brand, largely being in control of what they publish and what they develop. They even directly went against their parent company and made/published games for rival platforms, which meant they had somewhat of a fractious relationship with Sony for a few years, to the point where Sony was even trying to sell them at one point. But they rescinded the intent to sell the company a few months later. With that said, by 1999, Sony had committed to a consolidation process with all its independent branches, meaning that pretty much overnight, Psygnosis went from being a semi-autonomous developer and publisher branch of Sony to a first-party developer and nothing more. The last game to be published under them was apparently a game called Metal Fatigue, though it may have also been Wings of Destiny, as I can't find any specific info on the release date. After which, the commitment to consolidation was so great that the company was renamed to SCE Studio Liverpool, a lame name with an even lamer logo. Then again, Sony's never really been good at naming their gaming divisions. Like, I know it's been a couple of decades at this point, but have we all just collectively accepted that the PlayStation is kind of a boring name for a console? Then again, nobody's really been able to make an evocative console name since Sega stopped producing them. Genesis, Saturn, Dreamcast, those were great names. But anyways, I can't even find any info about all the different branches of Psygnosis and what ended up happening to them after the consolidation process. The only info I can find on any of the spin-off studios would be the fact that the North American offices were closed in 2000, with publishing duties to 6 different games being handed over to Midway. This included Destruction Derby Raw and Colony Wars 3. We didn't know it yet, but this sort of spelt the eventual end for the company because the amount of games that they had developed by this point was a significant minority compared to the amount of games they had published, and several of their biggest hits weren't in-house productions. What they were left with was their own first-party intellectual property, as well as licensed properties that were given to them, and one can easily argue that their intellectual property didn't nearly have the same level of brand recognition as a lot of other intellectual property and couldn't necessarily sustain them long term. It didn't help that things like Colony Wars or G-Police were taken out behind the bike sheds before the end of the PlayStation's life cycle, but even if they couldn't publish games anymore, I still find it suspicious that by 2000, they weren't able to make anything outside of their 2 designated IPs. So it makes me think, aside from consolidating them into simply being a developer, Sony also took away their autonomy as far as being a game developer and vastly limited what they were allowed to make. And if that's true, that's really unfortunate. But going into the 2000s, they basically exclusively made Wipeout and Formula 1. Which honestly just makes their output not very interesting to talk about. They made a yearly Formula 1 game all the way up until 2007. It makes sense that they were given the Formula 1 license, given that Formula 1 racing is a much bigger deal in Europe than North America. Might as well give it to a European developer. Meanwhile, in North America, we're much more keen to drive around in a circle for hours on end. But Formula 1 was taken away from them when Codemasters bought the licensing after Sony let it expire, at which point SCE Liverpool only had one more string to its bow, Wipeout. And from there, the last 3 games as well as a DLC were exclusively Wipeout games. The last of which came out for PlayStation Vita. Man, if I had a nickel for every time Sony closed down a long-running studio after they made their final game on a piece of hardware that nobody owns, I would have 2 nickels. If you're confused, SCEE Cambridge Studio, the people who made Medieval, Primal, and one of the variations of Little Big Planet, closed down after making a game for PSVR back in 2016. Although SCE Liverpool weren't necessarily closed down in August of 2012, as the facility remained open with staff from various SCE divisions using it for other projects. But it was functionally closed down as the developer ceased operations at that point. So what happened here? Well, I don't consider myself the most well-researched person on topics like this, but based on my observations, Sony kind of just cut their legs out from under them the moment they were no longer required to operate a certain way. Like, yeah, they had a brief falling out with Psygnosis at one point over the fact they wanted to do their own thing under Sony ownership, but after Sony had established global market dominance in video games and had a foothold in every major region with their first-party publishing branches, all it took was for them to look at their own books and see secondary publishing branches as a redundancy that everything that Psygnosis was suddenly came to a halt. Matter of fact, I can't find any specific info on this front, but given how these things usually go, I would not be the least bit surprised if the change in direction coincided with several members of senior staff leaving. And if it was more highly publicized, I'm sure that would be a story on a website here or there. In fact, I was curious about this, so I did something I haven't done in a long time. I went on LinkedIn. Of the 3 founders of Psygnosis, Jonathan Ellis left in September of 1996, David Lawson left in August of 1989, and Ian Hetherington stayed the longest, staying until 1998. Though he sadly passed away a couple of years ago at the age of 69. So unlike a lot of instances with various companies, by the time the consolidation happened, all 3 of the founding fathers of the company had already left. So there were no senior staff notable enough to have left and actually make a splash. But I still bet dollars to donuts that there were probably people who left, so at the dawn of the PS2, suddenly all those weird avant-garde and sometimes not very good games that Psygnosis either made or published were simply tossed into the wind. And obviously, what they had left was able to sustain them for a time, but unfortunately, diminishing returns caught up to that. Santa Monica can survive on God of War, Insomniac can survive on Spider-Man. Wipeout, as relatively popular as it may have been and as good as it was, seemingly had a shelf life, and it seems that shelf life expired in August of 2012. Upon their deaths, there were 2 games that were cancelled, another Wipeout game as well as a third-person stealth action game that was completely unlike anything they'd ever made before. But it was not meant to be, and several staff went on to establish 2 separate spin-off studios. First of all, Playrise Digital, which found minor success with tabletop racing, although they haven't made anything since 2016, so I would hazard to guess that they went defunct at some point. And they're such a nondescript company that I couldn't even find any info on that. The other spin-off company was Firesprite, which is still operating to this day. They even helped with Horizon Call of the Mountain. So the story had a bit of a happy ending. Even still, this is yet another dead game developer to add to the pile, and I guess they have a strange mixed history that only really appeals to people of a certain age. People who can distinctively remember that very unique logo, people who enjoy their first-party games, and people who enjoy their weird, obscure games they published. And it is a bit sad for reasons that I honestly find hard to articulate, because this should be one of those cases of who the hell cares. But I guess this company existed in such an odd space of time and existed in such a weird niche that's never been replicated, and I find it weirdly compelling for that. But I guess too, that's because I find this era of gaming so weird and compelling in a lot of cases, especially once you move past the mainstream games that everyone's familiar with. I don't know, maybe I'll never be able to fully articulate exactly what it is that made this company so unique and so intriguing, but never again will we see a secondary publisher with such a diverse back catalog and such a wonderfully weird creativity to it. And at the end of the day, I guess that's what I find so unfortunate about this company, is that we'll never see its like again. Games have too much money in them, and too many people with their fingers in the pie to be able to create games like this anymore. At least on a AAA level. That's all I've got. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content, along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Dick Kickham, Gaw004, Hydra Overlord, FarmCat84, Raph, Ranger X, Sphinx, Weird Webster, and Will Stokes for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.